Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Where Eagles Dare, where we integrate the national security and your financial security and the issues of cybersecurity together in one issue, because we believe that is where the greatest vulnerabilities lie, but it's also where the greatest opportunities are to make money.
In a sense, what they do is they take the weaknesses of democracy, which is that there is a change of power. It's one of the great strengths of democracy. It's also one of the great weaknesses of democracy. There's a routine change of power every 4 years, every 5 years, whatever it may be. And they use that against its own best interests. The idea that you could say not all cops are bad and have people call you a Nazi or a fascist for it would have been laughable 20 years ago, and yet that's where discourse has gotten to. Kind of strength that they can just keep printing their own money, keep borrowing it to themselves at no cost. All they're doing is kicking a can down the road. They're building a Jenga tower that has to fall at some point. And I think that what we're seeing right now in China with BSN is a really interesting contender to dollar hegemony, because in the developing world, it's extremely difficult to get hold of capital.
And with me today, we have, let's just call him James. James is somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere, and he is a operator with the British establishment. And today we're going to be talking about some issues that he's very familiar with and intimately connected with. And that is sort of the strategic take on where we are with America's vulnerabilities as we go forward into 2021, no matter who becomes president. So James, let's first talk about, we wrote a piece, and you wrote almost all of it, for my clients this last week on the vulnerabilities of the Maginot Lines of the US. So explain kind of the concept of the Maginot Line, and we'll talk about these three that you highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Paul. Always a pleasure. So when we talk about the Maginot Line, we're leaning on the lessons of history, and we're looking at the Second World War, where the French built what they believed was an impenetrable defensive line. And in fact, it was an impenetrable defensive line. The Nazis didn't penetrate it, they went around it. And so it's become this very apt analogy for any time that an actor defines a battleground, defines a set of rules that can easily be subverted. You know, the more you concentrate your strength, the easier it is to work out ways around that strength for your enemies. So with the context of US hegemony around the world, we've identified three Maginot Lines. So the first off would be the traditional stick, if you like, from the carrot and stick analogy, military force, primarily represented now with special ops, drone assassinations, fleets in the aircraft carrier groups, and US military bases and garrisons around the world. The second
right, so yeah, exactly. So let's talk about the first one, which is
sure.
The fact that much of the arsenal of defense and offense for the U.S. globally is comprised in these 11 aircraft carrier groups. Is this a Maginot Line, or was it a real threat?
I think 10 years ago it was a very real threat. You know, we only have to look at the list of countries that have been regime changed as they've tried to move away from the dollar. And we know that the aircraft carrier groups have worked. However, once you use a tool too many times, your enemies will start to anticipate it. And that's where it starts to become this Maginot Line. We're using the technology of 30 years ago and the solutions of 30 years ago to try and fight future wars. These carrier groups are concentrations of power, and they represent concentrations of power that are supposed to be able to project capabilities. What's actually happened is they've become very immobile and very fixed by either the need to bolster client states and provide security for them, as we see in the Pacific Rim, or the need to intimidate enemies, as we see in the Gulf. You know, we have to keep a fleet watching Iran because otherwise Iran might do something that we don't like. So we have to keep a fleet in the Gulf. We have to keep a fleet in the Pacific Rim because we have to be able to counter Chinese moves in the South China Sea. And what ends up happening is assets actually become fixed rather than being highly mobile, highly agile, responsive projection tools. They become these fixed tied down assets that actually just cost an awful lot of money, but don't have a great deal of utility.
Okay, so James, the second part of this is the issue of the special operations units and other physical defensive assets that are in 800 installations in over 80 countries. And you know, what's your take on the effectiveness of these types of groups to counter terror in all these dozens of countries?
Well, I think when we're talking about the effectiveness, when we're assessing effectiveness, we just have to look at how far the US is having to go down this rabbit hole. So what started out as quite successful small-scale direct action or kinetic action attacks on specific individual terrorists has now led to an ever-expanding kill list that has no sign of slowing down. The pace of special operations in the last 20 years has increased exponentially, and it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the men themselves, and it's not sustainable for the country as a whole, because the cost of these operations, both in terms of manpower and in terms of the kind of supporting assets to support these combat arms, it's just spiraling out of control. And once you start down this pathway of trying to police the entire world through direct action strikes and through drone strikes, you know, these targeted assassinations is what it comes down to. Once you start down this road, you can't really back away from it. It's become routine now to have drones flying over Waziristan and targeting terrorist leaders in Waziristan. It's become routine to have special forces operations around the world, you know, Philippines all the way through East Africa, West Africa. It's just expected that these things are happening. And if you take your foot off the gas, what fills that power vacuum? So the US is doubling down because of this kind of sunk cost fallacy that they've got themselves tied up with commitments around the world that they can't possibly fulfill.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, you know, also is a point of legality, where I have some friends who work in the criminal investigative services for the armed forces. And of course, you have a lot of these groups, you know, Green Berets, Delta Force, you know, Navy SEALs, who are you know, taking the law into their hands and doing things that they're under orders to do, which are in fact either illegal or unethical or both. And you have a law unto themselves. Would that be your assessment?
I think without going into specifics, there have been an awful lot of cases where it's been demonstrated that a workplace culture and a workplace ethos centered around extreme acts of violence has resulted in illegal activity. And once that sort of moral ambiguity once that moral ambiguity is allowed to spread, it becomes very difficult to contain. You have these very small units that primarily answer to themselves, or within a limited chain of command with very little oversight. And sometimes what ends up happening actually harms US interests overseas more than it would support them. You know,
Okay.
it's very difficult to defend extrajudicial killings. It's very difficult to defend kidnappings. And the US ends up leaving fingerprints, whether it means to or not. You know, there are only so many countries that are going to fly a drone and drop ordnance on somebody's house. There are only so many countries that have the ability to project special operations units around the world. And it ends up providing a fantastic recruitment tool for would-be enemies of the United States.
Yeah, no, these are great points you're making. Let's move on to the second Maginot Line, which is the issue of finding fissures in local political issues and causing those fissures to widen through countermeasures. So what's your take on that?
I personally think that this is where the future of warfare is. Well, not even the future, this is where we're at. This is what's happening right now. Russia has been fantastic at it. It's not up for debate. It's not a conspiracy theory. They are conducting what in the old parlance would be active measures, in which they seek to influence the political spectrum within a country, and in so doing affect policy changes in their favor. With the advent of big data and big data analysis, it's become that much easier for them to do it. So in a sense, what they do is they take the weaknesses of democracy, which is that there is a change of power. It's one of the great strengths of democracy. It's also one of the great weaknesses of democracy. There's a routine change of power every 4 years, every 5 years, whatever it may be. And they use that against its own best interests. How it works is where it gets really quite interesting. So if we think of the political pendulum, you know, it swings a little bit to the left this year, it swings a little bit to the right next year. But broadly speaking, the public is brought along. Those on the right end of the spectrum will move a little bit towards the left, you know, maybe more towards the center, and then vice versa, and it just goes on. What these active measures are doing today is they're breaking the pendulum in half. And the idea of the Overton window, the acceptable political discourse, is shattered, and you end up with separate Overton windows of acceptable political discourse. And these windows eventually become self-sustaining. They become increasingly divergent. So you'll have one group on the left for whom they have their own worldview, their own understanding of reality. And you'll have one group on the right that has their own understanding of reality. And anything that the other group says would be completely unacceptable. So the left would find what the right is saying completely unacceptable when they say, you know, not all cops are bad, it's a few bad apples. That's racism for the people on the left. For the left, when they say Black Lives Matter, well, the guys on the right will say, well, they're just Marxists, and they want to overthrow US democracy. And so you end up with these divergent groups that cannot possibly agree. They can't find a middle ground because their worldviews are inherently diametrically opposed. And what's particularly interesting is that neither of those statements would have been all that controversial 10, 20 years ago. The idea that you could say not all cops are bad and have people call you a Nazi or a fascist for it would have been laughable 20 years ago. And yet that's where discourse has gotten to.
Yeah.
So essentially, you know, this could be a book in and of itself, and we could talk about it for days, but it's about funneling small amounts of information in, and then that information gets laundered by domestic actors. People distribute material. I'm sure that we've all seen it. If we're honest with ourselves, we've all seen things on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram that we've believed the second we read the headline rather than reading the full story, rather than looking at where it came from, because it fit with our worldview.
Yeah,
and it
yeah.
becomes remarkably easy to radicalize people, particularly when they're despondent or economically disenfranchised.
Which so many Americans are at the moment. The good book here that is worth reading is Christopher Wiley's whistleblowing book called Mindfucked, with an asterisk on the U to make you not say that word. But it's a very good book. It goes into great detail about Facebook's. He was a senior Facebook employee in London, and it talks about the U.S. election. James, talk about what you think happened in the UK election for the Brexit and whether Russian measures were present there. What's your take on that?
I don't think that it's really up for debate. I'm absolutely convinced that that there are Russian fingerprints all over this. But even if we ignore the evidence, we just look at the result. Who would it make happy to see a weaker European Union, a weaker Great Britain, and a less cohesive economic and defensive strategy across Europe? Well, it sounds to me an awful lot like Russia would win in that scenario. We can just look at these broader trends and say, well, you know what? Cambridge Analytica's fingerprints were all over it. Their fingerprints were all over the US election. Russia's involvement in the US election was kind of beyond a doubt at this point. There is a great deal of suggestion that they were involved in the Brexit campaign, as with many other pushes to populist policies across Western Europe. And I don't think it's that much of a stretch. I mean, they stand to gain by perpetuating and exploiting the fault lines in society, and it's particularly easy to do in very unequal democracies where there is a big disparity between the rich and the poor. We've had recession after recession. It's easy to do. It's easy to radicalize people to very polarized.
Tell me why the British institutional class did not take Russia on and and go after them. Mueller arrested and indicted and convicted 12 Russians who were on the FBI's most wanted list. Why did the UK government not do that?
I think that might have to be a question for the Prime Minister, and why they haven't yet released the Russia report. We have our own Russia report in the UK, and it hasn't been published yet. It's been delayed. It would be very interesting to find out why. But I would suggest that, as in the US, where Trump doesn't want to accept that Russia had any part in his victory, in his electoral support, I would suggest that it's probably a similar situation where there is self-interest at play. Politicians don't want to admit that they came to a position of power because of the intervention of a foreign actor.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I guess that simple answer has to be the correct answer. Let's move on to the third one, because you made a really terrific point in the work that we did together this last week, that is the real Maginot Line the U.S. dollar. I mean, America keeps its global imperial hegemony through the dollar and has done that very cleverly for 50, 60 years, especially in the pricing of oil in dollars. And how is that now being put in jeopardy if we think about the dollar as a Maginot Line?
Well, I think the line between the US dollar and that soft power diplomacy and the US hard power military diplomacy is actually becoming increasingly blurred under this administration. And with the weaponization of the dollar that we've seen, it's become kind of a blunt instrument, and not necessarily to the US's advantage. So the military requires huge amounts of dollars to keep the machine functioning. And the more that these assets are fixed in place, as we talked about earlier, the more money that's required to keep them operational. Low-cost insurgencies require an awful lot of money to fight them. And the US has been fighting a lot of insurgencies. So on the one hand, the US has ended up overextending itself because it has to borrow from itself. And whilst that might seem like a kind of strength, that they can just keep printing their own money, keep borrowing it to themselves at no cost, all they're doing is kicking a can down the road. They're building a Jenga tower that has to fall at some point. They're creating a bubble. And when they then decided, okay, let's start weaponizing the dollar to punish the Chinese, or let's start weaponizing the dollar, or threatening to remove Russian oligarchs from SWIFT and pull these sanctions as a means of getting people to come back to the table. When they started doing that, what they've actually done is made it a certainty that the dollar will be subverted. Lots of people have tried before, Iraq, Libya, Venezuela, to move oil away from the dollar. And that was seen as the only way that you could defeat the dollar as a global currency. But if we lean heavily on the Maginot Line analogy, you don't smash through the Maginot Line, you drive around it. We don't need to replace the dollar with a competitor in the same market. We need to create a new market and then encourage people to use the new market rather than the dollar market. And I think that what we're seeing right now in China with BSN is a really interesting contender to dollar hegemony, because in the developing world, it's extremely difficult to get hold of capital, and capital can be very expensive. If you can provide easier access to capital using BSN, then people will take it. And if you can get the developing world to switch to your currency, then the rest of the world will end up following. If you can move them away from the dollar, if you can move certain key commodities away from the dollar and make use of cryptos more attractive, then I think that's really the answer right there.
Yeah, and it seems that with China both turning its own currency into a crypto PBOC coin, which is one of the, I believe, I think I'm pretty right in that it is the most advanced and the most, it's the most advanced research and execution so far of any central bank in the world. And I believe they've already rolled it out in several cities, whereas most other central banks are still in the R&D phase. And so the PBOC is probably 2 to 3 years ahead of the Fed. When you glue that onto the BSN and the now current ability of, I believe, 10 different crypto coins are accepted onto BSN now, you're starting to get a momentum here, which is hard to break. And this is basically the use of these cryptocurrencies to access RMB for any kind of trade or service. And also, very importantly, the counter trading of cryptos interoperability via the BSN. And so we're getting pretty advanced, in a very short period of time. What's your take on that?
Well, I think looking at it purely from a strategic standpoint, it just makes too much sense. If all of your enemy's strength, if you're fighting against a Goliath and his strength comes from he's absolutely huge and he's going to pulverize you, and you don't fight on equal terms with him, you cheat. You pick up that rock and you pull out a slingshot and you cheat. And I genuinely believe that this represents the clearest contender so far. This is going to be the rock that takes down US hegemony, unless the US is able to adapt with similar levels of agility. If the US wants to maintain its hegemony it needs to start looking at anti-fragility measures, and it needs to start doing it now. Really, it needed to start doing it 20 years ago, so that it has decentralized forms of power that can continue to operate independently of itself, and decentralized currencies that can continue to be used to exert influence around the world.
Yeah, so can you think of an example of sort of a decentralized economic? I mean, would the U.S. need to create sort of like economic blocks with some sort of crypto? I don't know. It's not sure to me. It's not clear to me how the U.S. can respond economically on that one.
Yeah, so I've been toying with this idea that what they might be able to do is issue their own coin or a series of coins that would run kind of parallel to their dollar economy, and allow them to sort of ring fence all of their bad debt, and sort of get that under control, bleed it out, whilst keeping the machine kind of oiled with cryptos moving.
Yeah, and I think that my sense is, and my sense has been for at least a year, that was part of the plan with the rollout of the Libra coin via Facebook. I mean, that is your ring fenced, right? You have 1.5 billion active Facebook users, and if you turn Libra into sort of a means of exchange or a source of savings, you know, that's one possibility. As you and I discussed, the COVID package that was passed in June had a very obscure, you know, clause in there that was a very large, multi-tens of billions of dollars allocated to the Federal Reserve to create a Federal Reserve coin. However, it takes a long time. I believe China is now on year 6 of having been, you know, sort of playing with this coin idea for the central bank, and so I think this might take quite a long time. So look, we have to wrap up here, James. But in the first one, you know, in the first Maginot Line, you have a kind of an out of control, you know, global installations of 800 with, you know, 70,000 special operations forces operating all over. And you know, all we are getting from that is an ever larger, you know, kill list with the U.S., you know, fingerprints on it. And this may be causing an alienation of potential terrorists, you know, who would not have perhaps thought of doing so before. The best book that I have read on this is Surprise, Kill, Vanish. Excellent book, written by a lady who won a Pulitzer Prize, and so excellent book. The second one is the active measures to undermine democracy and split alliances and create increasingly, you know, virulently opposed sections of society, especially in the U.S. And it appears that, as you point out, the wedge issue, the fissure issue in the U.S. is the police violence against minorities in America, and that one has been highly effective to divide American society, where there is already a recipe for division by way of greater economic inequality and economic weakness for the lower rung of society. And the third one, and I so agree with you, I think BSN is a way to organize a lot of disparate crypto exchanges around the world and crypto currencies in order to create an alternative trading platform for RMB. You know, I think the bottom line there, James, is that, you know, you know, China's accounts for around 90% of all manufacturing goods, and yet the RMB in the reserve status of the world is around 4%, and it only accounts for around 35% of the manufacturers trading. And so this would be an interesting way around that Maginot Line of the dollar. Well, look, at great stuff, and you're such a terrific thinker. I really admire your strategic thinking in weaving military and cyber and economic issues together. This has been so great, and I'm glad that you were able to call in from, I can assure people, very uncomfortable circumstances, to say the least. So we're going to stay in touch and write some more soon. And so stay safe, and we will talk soon.
Absolutely. Thanks. It's